Welcome to the Sages Climate Science Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Young, environmental scientist and science communicator. And in this episode, we are thinking about the oceans, which is very relevant because although we call it planet Earth, this is a blue planet. We are covered in oceans, and I'm really excited to have two guests join us today. We have Dr. Philippa Rickard, who's an environmental scientist working at the interface between chemistry, biology and physics, thinking about water and air and that surface microlayer, a layer that is less than a millimetre thick, tiny. It's made up of lots of complex mixtures of organic matter that provides unique habitat for microorganisms in the central belt for global cycling of carbon, nutrients, gases, pollutants, and is impacted by human activities. And it covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. Philippa is interested in understanding microscale processes that govern the carbon cycle, ecosystem health, and ultimately the Earth's climate. Philippa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And we also have Professor Bill Austin, who is a professor at the School of Geography and Sustainable Development at the University of St Andrews. And you also have a visiting chair appointment at the Scottish Association for Marine Sciences, SAMS is sometimes what we call it, where he is Professor of Marine Geosciences. You've held fellowships from the Royal Society of London, Royal Society of Edinburgh, and is a founding member and continues to serve as chair on the UK National Environment Research Council. NERC is something that we call it in the Peer Review College. You also chair the Scottish Blue Carbon Forum with the Scottish Government, and you sit on the steering group of the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital and leads the United Nations Decade Programme for Blue Carbon in the Global Ocean, among many other things. But thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, maybe, Bill, you could kick us off because we do call this planet Earth, but it is a blue planet. David Attenborough maybe made that most famous with the series. I'm just wondering if you could start us by thinking about what role does the ocean play in climate change? Because maybe people think climate change in trees, that might be where you first go. But what about the ocean, Bill?
Well, thank you. I mean, the wonderful thing about this Sages podcast series, I think, is that we connect the various components of the Earth system. And as you've said, I think the oceans are just a very important part of that process. The oceans are incredibly important for the transfer of heat and energy around the planet. And as we heard in the introduction, they're really important for exchanges with the Earth's atmosphere. And I think that's probably the key opportunity for our conversation today, and particularly the global carbon cycle. So I think what we might be able to do is discuss and explain some of these ideas around the carbon cycle and our climate system linked to the oceans.
And Philippa, the ocean has often been we don't know a lot about it. There's a lot of unknowns. I think I once read, we know more about the surface of the moon than we sometimes do about parts of the ocean. But what do we know about, do we know enough about the ocean? And what role has, Scotland played in that research?
Well, we even know more about deep space than we do about the deep ocean, really. There are a lot of knowledge gaps there, and it is really such an area for exploration and a lot of adventures on my part as well, to be honest. But bringing it into the carbon cycle and climate, I mean, a long time ago, it was just assumed that we knew how everything interacted, and that with the progression of climate change, that the ocean was going to absorb carbon, and that was just what was going to happen. But even in the last 30 or 40 years, we've started to understand that actually processes in the ocean impact the carbon cycle on annual, decadal, centennial scales. So really, we don't know a lot. It keeps us in a job, but it is just a very active area of exploration. And Scotland's history in the area of oceanography was that Sir John Murray set up the first marine station in Scotland in 1884, and that was kind of the birth of oceanography in Scotland, and he's considered the father of modern oceanography. So Scotland has a very deep history with the oceans, and rightly so, we've got amazing coastline in this country.
I think just picking up on that point of the history of ocean observation, and it's an active field of research, of course, so there's always new things to learn. Sure. But I think this extraordinary wealth from that early investment in ocean science and in ocean observation, we're beginning to realize just how important these records are. You know, the Faroe Shetland Channel observations of salinity and temperature really led us to this understanding of the Atlantic overturning, meridional circulation, the AMOC, as it's sometimes called, sometimes known as the Gulf Stream. And we began to see evidence from Scottish observations with Faroese colleagues that this system was changing. And this was a really important signpost that our oceans are actually very sensitive as part of this heat transfer in the oceans. So if viewers know the Day After Tomorrow movie, then that's based on science that was started here in Scotland. And I think that point about observing the oceans and that investment in science, it is very important. It's difficult to know what's coming sometimes in terms of policy. And, we need a strong ocean science base to help us be ready, I think, for some of these challenges and to understand how the systems work.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're studying a changing system as well, which complicates things even more. So actually being at the forefront of it and it being a really dynamic area to work in and well funded, it's really important.
And I think it's great to know that history, absolutely, and that knowledge. But, it's interesting, you mentioned a movie, and I think movies can actually be quite powerful. And we've talked in the podcast a lot about how movies help people understand a lot of these concepts. And Bill, you were just mentioning about the movement of the ocean. And I think often people think the ocean is just bodies of water that sit still, but actually they do move around. And one movie, I think, that first taught me this was Finding Nemo, when the turtles would jump on the stream. Is that what you're talking about when you say, these kind of the Gulf Stream and the movement? Is that a good representation of what's happening?
Hey, dude.
Hey, dude, indeed.
I remember that. Yes, that's exactly it. And these are concepts which I think can be readily understood, but in their detail, of course, they are more complex. But I think these notions of a circulating ocean are really important to think about how we might, for example, model our global climate system. And then we begin to realize that, having this understanding of the physical oceanography is important, even if we're interested in the carbon cycle. Because these systems are interrelated, there are feedbacks, and, we need a healthy ocean science community to be able to really address all of these challenges.
And Philippa, you've both actually mentioned the carbon cycle, and I think from school people might be more familiar with the water cycle. So you've got water in all its different formats: ice, snow, frozen in the ground, water, clouds, and it moves round and round. And there was a song, I'm sure, that went with it. But we also have cycles with carbon. And people might be more familiar with that on land. They think of soil or plants. Could you maybe just give us a bit of reflection on how the carbon cycle interacts with our oceans?
So I guess it's, if I can just rephrase that a little bit, that it's not necessarily that the carbon cycle interacts with the ocean. The ocean is an integral part of the carbon cycle. And land and ocean is completely connected. And yeah, you're right. We often think about the carbon cycle with respect to trees and soil, and the trees essentially being the lungs of the earth. But land and ocean are they're connected. Carbon can move from the atmosphere to trees, to the soil, get washed into the water. And the water cycle is part of this as well. It's a very good conduit for moving carbon around. It ends up in the water. Carbon can move from the water to the atmosphere, but it can also sink to the deep ocean where it's stored for millennia sometimes and then be released back to the atmosphere. So as Bill was saying, it's all, when you look at the finer scale processes, it all gets quite complicated, but actually the big cycle is that everything is connected on this planet and we're part of it as well.
If we imagine the plants in the surface ocean, they would photosynthesize in the way that trees on land will take in carbon dioxide and they will release oxygen. And in fact, if we were to stop for a moment, take a deep breath, take another deep breath, take a third deep breath, take a fourth deep breath, two of those breaths, that oxygen that we're breathing in, that we're dependent on, has actually been produced by plants in the ocean. So that's an extraordinary way of thinking about how valuable the oceans are to us, and to life on the planet. So, that's one way that I like to think about the importance of the oceans to the health of the planet.
And, you talked there, Philippa, about trees are often known as being the lungs of the earth. But what Bill's saying is actually the ocean is.
50% of the oxygen we breathe, is produced by the oceans. And when I first learned that fact, it totally blew my mind, because I don't think a lot of people are actually aware of that. And it's the reason I got into ocean science, because they are so important for our survival as well. Yeah.
And I now know that the carbon cycle doesn't interact with the ocean. It's actually the ocean is an integral part of that. And there's a term that has become really popular when thinking about the ocean and carbon, and that is blue carbon. And Bill, I know a lot of your work has surrounded this topic. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of a definition or explanation of what is blue carbon?
Yes, I mean, it's part of the connectedness that we were just discussing. And of course, as well as the terrestrial biosphere, we have this marine and coastal ecosystem. And blue carbon represents, in its strict definition, coastal vegetated ecosystems. So there are three main habitats. These have been defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They are considered to be actionable in, for example, our net zero ambitions for government, and they include mangrove forests in the tropics. We don't have those in Scotland yet. Our salt marsh habitats, very widely distributed here in Scotland, around the UK. And then our subtidal and intertidal seagrass meadows. And seagrass, of course, is very important as nursery ground for juvenile fisheries. So these three habitats are termed blue carbon. That concept is expanding all the time, of course. So we might think about seaweeds or macroalgae, as they're sometimes called, being part of our blue carbon opportunity. And if we manage those systems and they provide a sink for carbon into a store, maybe in the soils in a salt marsh habitat, then that can be counted as additional carbon that's been taken from the atmosphere and held in the ground. So a little bit like our fossil fuels, what we really are trying to do is keep these stores of carbon buried in the Earth system, and they will help us in the fight against climate change. So broadly, that's what we mean by blue carbon.
And I think those three examples are great for people to picture. And I did some research on mangroves in Mexico. Yep, we don't have them here. And it's this amazing tree. And it's almost like, it looks like the roots are almost above ground, and it sits right on the coast. So sometimes the water, when the tide's in, will be completely throughout the forest. And when the tide's out, you see this kind of bare structure, and you could almost climb underneath all of the roots. And we don't have those. But the other ones you mentioned, salt marshes and seagrass, where might people see these in Scotland or in the UK? Where could you find these environments?
Yeah, seagrass a little bit harder, but there are plenty of places on the west coast where you can, for example, go snorkeling or wading at low tide and see seagrass. I'm thinking about some of the sea lochs on the west coast, for example. And our salt marshes are very widely distributed. So here in Scotland, in the Midland Valley area, in the Firth of Forth, there's an RSPB reserve at Skinflats near Grangemouth, great place. See lots of wading birds, and you can actually see their efforts to create and restore salt marsh habitats. And that's one of the really exciting things about blue carbon, is that we can let the sea back in to places that were once drained, perhaps to create agricultural land, and recreate these lost habitats. And when we do that, we get benefits for wading birds, which is why the RSPB, of course, do these projects. But we also get the benefits for carbon storage in those sites.
I think it's beyond that as well, though, isn't it? There's the benefit for the local communities as well. Enjoying the restored habitats.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of rethinking coastal management in a way. And some of these schemes can be beneficial for coastal flood prevention. So in large estuaries, for example, if you reopen up the floodplain, which is often protected by seawalls, you give high floodwaters spaces to escape into, and that can reduce the impacts of coastal flooding, for example. So there are lots of benefits of working with nature. We sometimes call these, nature-based solutions, and they provide climate mitigation, but also the other benefits, the adaptation benefits as well.
A few times mitigation and adaptation has been mentioned. Bill, would you just maybe be able to give a quick definition on what we mean when we talk about climate mitigation and climate adaptation?
Yes, I'll start with climate mitigation. The idea here is that we want to mitigate against these negative effects of climate warming, climate change. And to do that, we can draw down some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we can do that, for example, in these blue carbon habitats. That represents an additional store of carbon. And if that store of carbon is held for some time, that reflects a mitigation action. It's sometimes referred to as climate abatement as well. And then with climate adaptation, what we're trying to do here is think about not changing the course of future climate change, which we know is going to happen, but rather how can we work with those changes? So that's the adaptation piece. And for our coastlines, with rising sea levels driven by climate change, that's going to be incredibly important. And it's important for these blue carbon ecosystems because they live on that very coastal edge. And so they have to help us adapt to climate change.
And I think that's, really important to think about how we work with nature rather than against it often, which maybe is what we've done in the past. Bill, you talked about floodplains, and I guess people might be familiar with that, maybe thinking about flooding and houses and things being built in the wrong places or, areas that are supposed to get wet. You talked about opening those up. What does that actually look like?
Well, that's a terrifying prospect, I suppose, in many ways. We think about protecting our coastlines from the threat of rising sea levels. And that's an understandable reaction to the risks. But in some places where land has perhaps been reclaimed from the sea historically, we've lost about 80% of these salt marsh habitats around the UK over historical times, sometimes over hundreds of years. We can open up those sea defences. Sometimes they're broken down by storms, and it might be a decision to just let the sea back in. But sometimes we can do that deliberately. That's called coastal managed realignment. We might set a new defence a little bit further inland, just in case we're worried about the sea coming too far. But that process lets the sea back in on low-lying ground, where it naturally wants to flood, where it can recreate these coastal habitats for us. We don't have to do anything else. It will do it. Job for us. And
we do see that, don't we, in places where maybe it's been landfills that have been built up on bits that used to be the ocean, or we've built shipping industry or ports. So is there bits of Scotland where that's more familiar?
Well, Scotland in general has relatively limited opportunity, and that's because we had glaciers here about 20,000 years ago, and so the land has been slowly uplifting. Now, whilst sea level rise has overtaken that uplift, the amount of area available for coastal flooding is still relatively limited. But elsewhere around the UK, you know, there are opportunities, and there are examples here in Scotland. I mentioned the Firth of Forth and the Skin Flats RSPB managed realignment. There's also the RSPB Nig Bay Reserve up in the Cromarty Firth, and lots of opportunity in that area to perhaps recreate some of these habitats.
Bill, you used the phrase silver bullet there for kind of solving the problems. But do we need to be careful that we don't just try and solve the problems without actually looking back at what we've done to get ourselves in this state?
Absolutely. That's a great point. And the message I would give to those listening today is that first and foremost, we all have a collective responsibility to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. These solutions from the ocean, these solutions from nature are going to help us get to those end goals, but they won't in themselves help us achieve net zero. We do have to reduce emissions.
Thinking, Philippa, about the carbon cycle, the oceans, blue carbon, but also the research that you do, which is across this tiny little layer that is kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about the research that you're doing and some of the history of how much we know about that little layer and that carbon cycle that happens.
So I know it sounds super niche, but yeah, I study 1 millimetre of water, but it does cover 70% of Earth's surface. So, you know, it's a lot of water, really. It's a big 1 millimetre. And within that 1 millimetre is a distinct ecosystem compared to even a few centimetres below the water, in the water below. It controls how quickly gases transfer between the atmosphere and the ocean. So when I talk about being interested in microscale processes that govern the global carbon cycle, that's what I'm talking about. Because the capacity of our ocean to absorb carbon is still there, but we need to understand how these processes will be impacted as we move forward with climate change. Because it's not the same everywhere, even though this millimetre is everywhere, and I promise it is everywhere. It's completely naturally occurring, but how it impacts gas transfer is different in coastal regions, in ocean regions, and what direction the gas goes as well is different. Depending on season, depending on water temperature, depending on pH, depending on all of the salinity, depending on all of the measurements that Bill was talking about that started in Scotland.
And how do you research that tiny little thing? What does your day-to-day look like?
So if we want to sample this top 1 millimetre, I have something, it's called a Garrett screen. It's named after the guy who invented it in 1945. And it is basically a big flat sieve. And I touch the top of the water with it, and the water surface tension just pulls that top 1 millimetre off. And then I get about 30 millilitres per dip. So and sometimes I've been in the middle of the ocean and I've collected 5 litres. It's taken a while. Wow. It's quite physical. But then, then we take that back to the lab and we do a whole suite of biogeochemical analyses on it. And we were talking about the interactions of physics, chemistry and biology, and that is what biogeochemistry is. So I am looking at the physics, the chemistry and the biology of a 1 millimetre of ocean.
Philippa, I'm really interested in this idea of this surface layer. You know, it's quite a new concept to me. Mm-hmm. I think as I was going through my ocean science training back in the day, we weren't so aware of this. And I'm particularly interested in the idea that we hear more and more about the pollution of the planet. Sure. And how this surface layer may be particularly vulnerable to pollutants in the environment. Can you tell us about that?
It's a really active area of research. There are a lot of unknowns. So you're right that historically the microlayer, it was assumed to be completely passive. Everyone was like, yeah, sure, it's there, but who cares? It doesn't really impact anything, but it is becoming more and more apparent. And I mean, within the last 20 or 30 years, that it is really important. And you're right, it is vulnerable to pollutants because it's an extreme environment anyway. It gets more sunlight than any other part of water. It's exposed to more wind. Anything that gets put into the water often, and pollutants often have a chemical structure where they like to be at the surface of things. So oil, just think of oil. It floats. And even things from, for example, paper mills, one of the most polluting industries in the world, they really impact this microlayer, and how that impacts the ecosystem within the microlayer. We don't really know.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, and you're reminding me of my vintage there as well. 20, 30 years ago, it probably predates when I was studying these things. So, yeah, thank you, Philippa.
But I think it's great to know that actually Scotland, with such a history of oceanography, didn't stop with just founding it and saying, well, we know enough. We're constantly saying, what more can we learn about this environment, and how can we use that for all sorts of different research, whether that's climate or communities, and I think it's interesting to know about this layer and how that works. And you talked there a little bit about a specific industry, paper mills, but when you talk about that, is that because industry is sort of sending out emissions and pollution and it just all likes to sit there?
Yeah, I guess. But we don't know how it redistributes. And this millimetre covers 70% of Earth's surface, and how the longevity of the chemicals that are put into the water, and then where they like to be floating, they could get transported all over the globe, really, but we're not really following that yet. Well, we are following, we're trying to, but we don't have the answers yet. And there's a lot of industry around the world that, not just paper mills, ships have a massive impact on this microlayer, not only on the carbon cycle, but also for putting emissions into the air, but also they physically disturb it.
Okay.
So when I'm saying it's a mixture of physics, chemistry, and biology, it really is, we're like, oh, well, there's this ecosystem, but then the additives to this ecosystem, such as pollutants, have one thing, but then the physical perturbation is something else. So.
And I think that comes back to, Bill, what you were saying about, the ocean has these movements. And, we've sometimes seen things like the rubber ducks that got lost at sea and started being found all over the world because actually the ocean moves things. Or we see things like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, as it's called, where all of this litter and plastic pollution gets swept into almost like a swirl and it gets stuck right in the middle of the ocean. And so, as you say, when things get polluted from one place, it doesn't mean it's gonna move around. And that innovation that you've seen with that microlayer, I guess, Bill, for the work that you've done with blue carbon, how far on are we with the research surrounding blue carbon?
Well, we understand these ecosystems pretty well. The habitats that I mentioned before, salt marshes and so on, have been studied for a long time. What's new here, I think, is the idea that they provide this service. So nature, rethinking the role of nature in providing all of the services that nature provides. And for carbon, we've begun to realize just the scale globally of the storage potential. And I think what's really nice in this space is that by restoring nature and protecting, re-establishing these habitats, perhaps managing them in a better way for the health of the habitat, we're actually seeing all sorts of benefits. And in the scale of the net zero climate emergency challenge that we're all facing, these are relatively low cost strategies. They're low risk, and they're, if I could put it this way, they're no-brainers. It just is sensible to restore nature. And I think that's the exciting thing about working in this field. But I was just thinking there about what Philippa was saying about the surface microlayer and pollutants. For me, what I'm hearing is the balance between our economic activities and the way that we think about the environment and protecting the environment. We're just coming closer and closer together. So I'm quite hopeful in a way that this knowledge will steer us, in a better way for the planet that we're living on. We hear a lot of negative stuff about the health of the planet, but I think as we learn more, we hopefully are getting to a place where the science can guide us to better outcomes. I don't know what you think.
Mistakes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. But when we're talking about the health of the oceans and natural solutions and stuff like that, there is a lot of active research that's looking at, say, technological solutions, right? But that's not necessarily... It's a very active area of debate in the scientific community at the moment, and talking about learning from our mistakes and moving forward with optimism. The scientific community in Scotland are very active in getting together like a code of conduct and bringing ethics, equitable solutions that are just as well, that we can do locally but also scale up globally. And yeah, there's a lot going on in
Philippa, that's really interesting, because I suppose I've been a proponent there for restoring nature, and what you're starting to introduce here is the idea that we could perhaps manipulate the oceans, engineer the chemistry of the oceans perhaps to deal with this climate emergency. And I acknowledge fully that blue carbon is only going to provide a relatively small fraction of the global mitigation. That's the reduction of greenhouse gas effort that we need. So it's not enough, it's not the silver bullet that we're looking for. I think we recognize that. And my worry, I suppose, is that marine carbon dioxide removal in the ocean, does carry some risks. And I guess it'd be good to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it does. It does absolutely carry risks, and there's a lot of very exciting and innovative ideas out there. I think the big one really is enhancing ocean alkalinity, which is often taking mining rocks and minerals, grinding them up, and either spreading them on the sediments or putting them on the surface ocean, which removes carbon from the water and allows the water to absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, going back to not really understanding how it's going to impact, altering the chemistry of the ocean will impact the ecosystems, is something that we really need to be careful for. It's a very exciting idea, but actually scaling it up, and on the scale we'll need to do it, it will have a massive impact on ocean health. And I am excited but cautious, I think, is the summary.
So I should add, there that I fundamentally agree with the need for the research. My worry, and I think the worry of others, perhaps more on the conservation side of things, is that as we manipulate the oceans to achieve these outcomes that we need to tackle the climate emergency, we're just not certain of the negative consequences yet. So
I agree
tread cautiously
with that. Absolutely, tread cautiously, because, and I was saying earlier, the feedback in the ocean, it can be annual, it can be decadal, it can be centennial, it can be millennial. Like, we don't know the long-term effects of any manipulation that we do.
And a feedback, in my mind, is that sort of like a domino effect, that if you start something you maybe don't know? Could you maybe chat a bit more about what would a feedback look like have we seen examples of that before?
I guess the greenhouse effect is a good feedback. So if people aren't familiar with what actually the greenhouse effect is, think about a greenhouse in your garden that when the sunlight hits it, it heats up because all of this air is trapped in it. And that's essentially what our atmosphere does. But as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the energy comes in and it heats up. But then it has this feedback in that it impacts our climate that then creates, say, for example, clouds that traps the air that heats it up more. So
keeps going.
It keeps going.
Keeps going.
Yes.
And an example in the sort of carbon cycle would be perhaps if we thought about the Arctic, which we know is probably warming at about 4 times the rate of the global average warming, that we're creating new ice-free marine environments. And, you know, that's a very exciting area for research. It's very concerning, of course, because that melting ice is contributing to sea level rise as well. But those newly emerging marine ecosystems, environments, may be cycling carbon in new ways that we don't fully understand yet. So there may be feedbacks in the high polar regions because of warming. Some of those feedbacks may actually take up more carbon from the atmosphere, so may inadvertently start to slow down the rate of warming.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
But also the ice melting decreases the albedo, which is the reflectance of the Earth, which allows it to absorb more heat, which melts more ice, which...
Yeah, I'm not saying that's a good thing. And in fact, you know, the transition to an ice-free Arctic is also releasing a lot of these greenhouse gases from Arctic soils. We know that. Work here in Scotland at the University of Stirling, you know, particularly focused on these releases of gases from tundra environments.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's complicated. The feedbacks, we don't understand all of them. So there may be these what sometimes called tipping points in the system. And we may just be moving sometimes towards a big change in the way that the system works without really knowing that that's just ahead of us. So that's kind of scary as well.
Thinking about this technology, and we want to be careful when we are embarking on investigating new technology that could help us. I'm just wondering, who polices all of this? Who manages this? The ocean is everybody's and nobody's. So how do we make sure we're doing that in a coordinated way, in a fair way, and in a way that is monitored? Philippa?
Well, it's a really good question. And it's a very, very active area of debate in the scientific community. I mean, me and Bill are in agreement about being cautious about these things. And that is the consensus among the scientific community. And I believe the UN are looking into this as well, because when these things are gotten a hold of, and they're very innovative and they're very exciting, but sometimes industry gets a hold of them. I'm not saying like everyone in the industry is bad, but when profit is brought into it, then ethics can sometimes go out the window, despite the best intentions of the people who developed the technology in the first instance. So how it's policed is an developing area at the moment, because as you say, international waters, they're everybody's and nobody's. But what we do in one area of water will impact communities and countries elsewhere in the world because of the dynamic nature of the ocean anyway. I do know that there was a code of conduct published by some of the scientific community in November 2023, so that's how recent it is, very much advocating for ethical use of technology, equitable use of technology, and just use of technology. But watch this space, really. And the scientific community are interested in it, industry are interested in it, and the public should be interested in it as well, really, because it affects everyone.
But I think it's important, and actually it's nice from my side to hear you reflecting on the unintended consequences that may or may not be there, but that actually not to jump 2 feet first into what is often exciting technological advances, which get a lot of attention, a lot of funding, a lot of excitement, but actually to stop and say, well, let's really try and consider what the outcomes might be, the consequences, but also looking to nature as well. And so you both do seem actually quite hopeful, though, at the potential. And I guess, Philippa, is there a potential for the ocean to become an even greater place for carbon to be stored?
So, yeah, the ocean still has the capacity currently to absorb more carbon dioxide. I think it's about 50% of atmospheric carbon is stored in the top few hundred meters of ocean water, and that's kind of short-term storage. The deeper ocean is the long-term storage. Talking about being optimistic, but the problem with the ocean absorbing more and more carbon is that it changes the acidity, and it increases the acidity of the ocean, which again alters the ecosystem. And where we are understanding more and more, like coral reefs are the big one that people are generally quite familiar with, but it impacts coastal ecosystems around Scotland as well. And as the ocean water warms with climate change, it actually decreases its capacity to absorb more carbon dioxide because colder water can dissolve more gases in it. So again, feedbacks that yes, there is more capacity currently, but it will impact and slow down over time.
And I think that coral reef example is a good one that people are familiar with, and that's because these corals have developed for centuries, thousands, many, many years, but they do need those perfect conditions. So when it gets warmer, saltier, more acidic, of course, we do see that change. And I guess, Bill, that's also not just a change for fish, for marine life, but for communities that also rely on the ocean. So, I mean, how important is it for all of us to kind of consider the knock-on effects to people as well?
Yeah, we could think perhaps of this tagline, a healthy ocean is a wealthy ocean. And it's a very good way of thinking about our relationship with the ocean, because we're very reliant. Communities are reliant on healthy ocean ecosystems. And I think that's, for me, where restoring nature, working with our marine ecosystems to manage them more effectively so that they have greater, what we call resilience. A healthy body can fight off disease, and a healthy ocean ecosystem is more likely to be able to stand up to some of the challenges of future climate change and the pressures that are building. And, the nature-based solution approach is one, if we think about it, it can deliver for climate. So we can do those blue carbon things and get the carbon locked away. It can deliver for people through the blue economy, fisheries, and so on. And it can deliver for biodiversity. And we talked a little bit about the organisms that live in the ocean, but the ocean holds huge wealth of biodiversity, probably not all yet discovered. And we're increasingly seeing a concern as the climate changes about the loss of biodiversity on the planet. And so we really need to do something to help nature. And I think these nature-based solutions, sorry to bang on, but they are a no-brainer in my view. They create fantastic opportunities for communities because you can engage communities. Here in Scotland, we've got great examples of seagrass restoration projects where communities have engaged. You're seeing benefits to the local economy. People begin to think about those restored habitats providing benefits for local fisheries. So you get better fisheries management planning, a more sustainable fishery. So, huge benefits. And this is something government recognizes. There's a great opportunity to do this in a joined up way. And I think this is where science is really important, because we need to provide the evidence to support the good policies.
And I love what you said about communities getting involved as well. I love a citizen science project. Any chance I get to contribute to a bigger project. Philippa, we've talked a bit about biodiversity within the ocean and other environments. What does that actually mean?
So biodiversity, it's short for biological diversity, essentially, and it describes the different number of species of organisms within a specific ecosystem. And we like biodiversity because it actually increases the resilience of an ecosystem to changes. If you think about, if you just have one type of grass in a field, it doesn't even have to be in the ocean, and then something comes in and kills it, and then that's the whole ecosystem gone. But if there's grasses, if there's plants, if there's trees, if there's bugs, if there's animals, everything has this niche that they play a part in the whole ecosystem functioning. So the more biodiverse, the more resilient the whole ecosystem.
I guess for both of you to end, what can people do? We are an island, so lots of people live by the coast or might love to travel in, or of course might live by a river that's connected to the ocean. What can people do in their local areas to help with this ocean protection?
I was really moved a few years ago when we saw the Blue Planet 2 programme, and we really began to wake up to plastic pollution. And we've seen some really nice policies here in the UK and Scotland. The introduction of charges for those disposable plastic bags, new measures to tackle plastic waste. So what I would say is, even if you don't visit the ocean or you don't think about the ocean very much, the plastic that we throw away can actually find its way into rivers, down into the sea, and can contribute to a problem that we can all be part of tackling that problem. So I think plastics have often been a way of us imagining how closely connected we are to some of the environmental problems that the ocean faces. And I think once you've got that concept in your mind, you can begin to realize that everything is then connected, and that individual actions, really can make a difference. So that would be the one I would give you, not blue carbon this time.
Do you want to add anything to that?
There are blue carbon projects that people can get involved with.
Oh, yes.
Aren't there?
Yeah.
But again, your area of expertise. But I guess a take-home message for people that builds on what you were saying about plastics is that the momentum of the general population really is what makes a difference and what makes change. It gets very much fed into policy, and the government very much start to listen when the general public make a bit of noise about stuff.
And I think that is exactly what we saw with Blue Planet 2, right? Enough people said, actually, yeah, I'm fed up of not having any choice with what my food packaging is or the products that I buy, and started that wave. Good ocean analogy, but a wave of people doing it. And actually there's so much people can do by having conversations with shops or with their local representatives or online, but also getting involved in some of those community projects, whether it's citizen science or even just visiting some of these amazing sites of protection that we have along the coast and in other areas. I think is a great one for people just to get connected.
Sure. And just to add very quickly, also to remember that, the plastic example is very, very visible, and it's very tangible and very easy to link to people's lives, because we see a plastic bag in the ocean and go, oh, I use plastic bags, or a plastic straw or something like that. And then but everything else we've talked about today, particularly carbon, it might be invisible, but we all have it's inextricably linked to our lives and our existence. So it's incredibly important. And like you say, just having conversations, going to the places that there's the Scottish Seabird Centre in North Berwick that does fantastic work, but they also talk about carbon. They also talk about the carbon cycle. So it's everywhere. Just get involved and ask questions, because we do like answering questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving us a bit of a whistle-stop and deep dive into parts of the ocean. And I think it's given me a real perspective of just how much ocean we have and how important each part of it is, whether that is that tiny, tiny top 1 millimetre or those areas that are right at the heart of some of our coastline that have this blue carbon. And I think it's helpful for us to understand as well how we go about protecting it. Okay, we don't just hard engineer solutions with technology. We actually need to look to nature to get some of those nature-based solutions and understand how we can best protect it and think ahead about not having any of those unintended consequences, and also think about what we can all do, right? We can all do something, and even if it's just having a conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Philippa Rickard and Professor Bill Austin, for being on this episode of the Sages podcast.
Lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.